You said earlier today during the egg roll that you would like to take Iran's oil, but Americans want U.S. forces home.
Correct.
What's that trade-off?
If I had my choice,
time?
yeah, because I'm a businessman first. With Venezuela, as you know, the war was over in about 45 minutes. And we have great people running Venezuela, very good people. I mean, the relationship is good. And we are a partner with Venezuela. And we've taken hundreds of millions of barrels, hundreds of millions. Over 100 million barrels already is in Houston, refined and out. And paid for that war many, many times over. Many times. You know, the old days, to the victim. Okay? You know that. To the winner belong the spoils. Go the spoils. And I've said, why don't we use it? To the victor, go the spoils. And we don't have that. We haven't had that in this country probably in 100 years.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakafzeli, along with our producer, M. Sinisa. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying but so far from dead.
As we are recording this right now, it is Monday, April 20th at 5:18 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The Strait of Hormuz is currently double blockaded still. There was a brief reprieve when the ceasefire with Lebanon finally came into effect, where Iran declared the Strait of Hormuz open for business under Iranian naval supervision, of course. And then Trump decided that the Strait of Hormuz would still be closed, but only to Iranian ships, at which point Iran decided the Strait of Hormuz would in fact not be open for business as long as that continued. So far, the United States Navy has only interdicted one Iranian ship, the Tuska, which it apparently did so suddenly and so unexpectedly that it has no idea what to do with it. This is according to reporting from American media, not just the Iranian media. They are thinking about potentially towing it to Oman, but really they have no idea what to do. The temporary ceasefire with Iran is set to end Tuesday, April 22nd, and I am not sure what will happen at that point.
So all told, it's now been over 50 days since oil freely flowed through the Strait of Hormuz. And the fuel shortages, which have already impacted much of Asia, are now spreading across the world. In total, we're looking at over 1 billion barrels of oil lost. So that's oil that would have otherwise flowed through the Strait of Hormuz, has not and will never flow. This means that no matter what is happening in the futures market, that is the derivatives market for trading oil, the competition over real physical barrels of oil is setting in. And in fact, the gap between what the future price of oil is trading at and what physical oil is actually commanding on the market is aggravating the crisis. Because what's happening is if you are in Asia and you typically get your oil from the Strait of Hormuz, from the Middle East, and you are contemplating sending, because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, sending an oil tanker all the way to the Atlantic to go pick up some American crude, you have to factor in what it would cost to ship that oil from much further away. And so people sitting in Asia are looking at what the market is saying the price of oil is going to be coming from Hormuz in a month. And the market is pricing in the Strait opening. So instead of sending their tankers all the way to the United States, they're sitting there waiting for Hormuz to reopen. But those prices are being artificially driven down. Hormuz is not reopening, and the diplomatic crisis continues. So what that means is that those shortages are going to get worse and worse. And because of that, reopening the Strait of Hormuz immediately has become the focal point of the US's diplomatic efforts and also its plans for potential military escalation.
Now, Trump was very optimistic about the potential for, if not a ceasefire extension for maybe even 60 days, a firm long-term deal last week. He said that there might be a deal in a day or two. Now it is looking like, after they decided that the blockade on Iranian ships would continue, that they may not meet tonight in Islamabad. They may not meet them on Tuesday either. So it is looking as though the hopes for a deal and a quick end to oil price shocks is getting very, very far away. And if I'm just examining where oil prices are at the moment, we are at $85.89. I would anticipate that they are going to be at least slightly higher by the time this episode comes out.
Yeah, I mean, we're in this classic Trump pattern that he's now done for the 6 or so weeks of this war, where during the start of the trading week, we are very optimistic about a deal. That optimism starts to wane, and when the weekend sets in and the markets close, then it's time for big, boisterous threats. We're going to destroy the entire country. We're very far from a deal, etc. And what this chaos has done is, A, it's made it very difficult for actual diplomacy to work because the Iranians are sitting with a bunch of very conflicting signals and commitments and statements about the state of play. But it's also totally shaken the markets, where basically now all traders believe that Trump is bluffing 100% of the time, that eventually he's going to back down, and they don't want to be caught holding the bag. And so they are not trading up the price of oil. And again, this is causing major dislocation in the market, where it can no longer be a usable tool as a price signal for the future, only compounding the real crisis of the physical shortages when they do hit.
There is, I think, a very illustrative statement from Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Baghir Ghalibaf from April 19th that I think should be read here. Vibe trading digital oil is like vibe hedging in treasuries during Hormuz risk-off. Both share one house of cards that works on paper. Difference? Oil at least has dated Brent. Treasuries? Vibes all the way down. EUCR-BRDT index GP, go. Some of you likely know what on earth that means.
I love it. He's trolling the traders. He's trolling Trump by doing his quanti epic digs. But he's right. He's right. They cannot manipulate. I mean, they can manipulate the treasury market so long as there's, broad confidence in the United States government not collapsing, although who knows how long that will last. But they cannot manipulate a market for physical commodities forever. And the thing is, okay, let's say that the negotiation teams do end up in Islamabad and there is a framework agreement that comes out of this summit in the next couple of days. The energy crisis that has been caused by the closure of Hormuz is unlikely to abate anytime soon. And that's because the closure of Hormuz really is Iran's leverage. So insofar as Trump is and the Americans are demanding permanent, irreversible concessions from the Iranians, they will need to hold on to that leverage to make sure that they get what they need for their national interest from the Americans in terms of sanctions relief, etc. This is stuff that can't happen quickly. So what that means is the dislocation in the oil market is going to continue for some time. And that's going to have profound impacts. And not just on oil, although people will certainly feel it at the pump. It's going to have profound impact for the trade in really important oil-based products, such as fertilizer, a key input in our food system. Also on petrochemicals and on the broader economy writ large. But it's also going to have profound political impacts. The trade in oil and the denomination of that trade in dollars has been key, as we've talked about on this show, for holding down a set of geopolitical relationships between the United States and the Gulf, between the Gulf and Asia, and many of the regional players more broadly. And when this all kicked off sometime in early March, I picked up a book called Crude Capitalism by Adam Hanieh. And this is a book I had seen floating around for some time. It was actually described to us by guest Laleh Khalili as a sister book of her excellent book, Sinews of War and Trade. And it really gets into the political economic structure of oil and its role in all of these political relationships and its role in capitalism more broadly. So I am very excited that we got Adam Hanieh to join us for this conversation to really flesh out what all of this means and really dig into the role of oil in U.S. foreign policy more broadly. Dr. Adam Hanieh is the director of the Middle East Institute at SOAS, University of London, and as I said, author of the excellent book, Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Adam Hanieh, Director of Middle East Institute at SOAS, University of London, and author of the book Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market. Dr. Hanieh, welcome to Turbulence.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are very excited to have you. So we're now about 7 weeks into this war, the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. And while there is a ceasefire nominally in effect, at least as of the time of this recording, the Strait of Hormuz remains largely closed. For the duration of this war, constraining the strait has been the primary source of leverage for the Iranians. They've been able to choke off a large percentage of the global supply of oil and other oil-based commodities like petrochemicals. The U.S. has been focusing a lot of its efforts, both militarily and diplomatically, on opening the strait back up. Can you explain why it is such a vital choke point for the world economy? Why is there so much attention on the strait?
Well, I think the last 7 weeks have really demonstrated how central the Strait of Hormuz actually is to the global economy. Firstly, it's absolutely critical to oil and gas exports. About 20% of the world's oil and gas flows through that narrow waterway. And of course, with the blockade and the closure of the strait, most of that is not getting through. There is a small amount that's coming through Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has an east-west pipeline and another port on the west coast of the country. So there is a small proportion of Saudi oil production that's coming out through that. But in terms of the other Gulf states, and of course Iran and Iraq, that strait is the main thoroughfare for their exports. So that's the first question, I think, is the impact that it's having on these global oil exports. Now, what what is really important to understand is that unlike the case for most of the 20th century, these oil and gas exports from the Gulf tend to flow eastward now. They flow to China and East Asia. About 70% of the Middle East exports, oil exports, go east at the moment. So the direction of those oil flows are very important. They don't flow to the US or to Western Europe at the same level that they used to. Now they flow eastward. The other thing I think it's really important to recognize, and is I think not really well understood in a lot of the coverage of this war, is that the Gulf is important not simply because it produces oil and gas. It's also really the linchpin of many of the world's industrial chemicals. Things, for instance, like helium. 1/3 of the world's helium supply comes from the Gulf. It's associated with the production of gas, and much of it comes from Qatar, which is a major gas producer. Now, helium is absolutely essential because it's used in the manufacture of semiconductors, in medical equipment, in kind of advanced technologies such as those. Another really critical chemical that comes from the Gulf is sulfur. About 45% of the world's sulfur exports come through the Strait of Hormuz from the Gulf. Again, this is a byproduct of oil and gas. And sulfur is essential because it is a main ingredient used in the manufacture of fertilizers and also in mining of metals. So, for instance, if we look at nickel mining around the world, nickel mining, which is obviously essential for EV batteries, depends upon sulfuric acid, which is made from sulfur. And a place like Indonesia that gets 75% of its sulfur from the Gulf is now faced with the sudden drop of access to that really critical chemical. And then the other really important product that the Gulf really sits at the core of globally is the food economy, in particular the manufacture of fertilizers. About 1/3 of the world's urea and ammonia, which are kind of essential nitrogen fertilizers, come from the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest exporter of urea. Oman, another Gulf state, ranks around 4th in the world in terms of urea exports. So this means that these critical nitrogen fertilizers, which about half the world's food production depends upon, is no longer flowing easily. So this really raises the question of how this crisis, how the closure of the Strait of Hormuz might actually impact food supplies and other kinds of manufacturing supply chains globally. So the point I really think it's important for us to take away from all of this is that we have to break from this stereotype of the region as simply just giant oil spigots. Yeah. They're critical industrial manufacturing and chemical centers, and that really does affect everything around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I want to return later in our conversation to this like east-to-east axis of the Gulf relationship with China and those export-import channels. But I want to pick up on that last point that you just made, right? It seems like a lot of the narrative around this is about oil, is about the price of oil. And to that end, I wanted to ask you about the latest development on the waters, which is the imposition of this U.S. blockade, or what they're calling a blockade. It seems like the logic from the Trump administration is to say, okay, well, if the Iranians are holding the world hostage via this mechanism of the price of oil, then we're going to flip it on them by blocking their ability to export oil and sell oil. It seems like this is a relatively short-sighted strategy, in part because of everything that you're just laying out. This isn't just about oil. It is about key inputs across the global economy. And it seems like this, I mean, at least in the early stages of it, it seems like this attempt at a blockade is really just shutting the strait further in terms of limiting the amount of commercial vessels that are going in and out. So I was wondering if you could comment on, like, how do you read the US blockade? Do you think that there is a real economic coercive logic to it, or do you read it more as just kind of signaling within the broader charade of this ceasefire?
Well, I think you're right in the sense that the logic, if we can use that word, of the Trump administration is that goal of choking off Iran's oil exports. Iran produces about 3.6 million barrels a day of oil, so just under 4 million barrels a day. So it's a significant oil producer. And of that 3.6, about half of Iran's oil production is consumed domestically. So they export about 2 million barrels a day. Now, what this blockade does is it means that because oil can't get out of Iran, it has to be stored if production continues at that same kind of rate. And obviously, there's a limit to how long that storage can and the available space for that storage. So the figures that I've heard is roughly about 16 days. That's the amount of space that Iran has for storage at its current level. And once it reaches that level, then oil production needs to be cut. So if that's the case, then that would have significant impacts on both Iran's ability to export and earn cash, as well as, of course, its domestic consumption. So I think that is where the Trump administration is coming from. But as you point out, it's a very dangerous and double-edged sword, not least because of the impact on other countries that depend upon all of those chemicals and fertilizers, in particular fertilizers. I think we need to talk much more about the kind of impact that this might have on food security in other parts of the world.
I'm wondering if you could speak more to the specifics of what could happen if the Bab al-Mandab is closed in conjunction with the Strait. We talked with Laleh Khalili, who I understand is a very good friend of yours, about this.
Yes.
Love her. She was unable to say a lot of specifics other than that it would be just catastrophic beyond measure and that it would just be unthinkable. I've seen Iranian media speculate about what granular choke points there would be, but could you speak to more specifics about that?
Well, I think Lale is absolutely right. It would be catastrophic. My reading of this is that this is the last card, if you like, in Iran's potential to retaliate, particularly if this current blockade by the Trump administration continues, because I think that would impact, of course, trade through the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal. It would impact those Saudi oil exports that I mentioned earlier that flow through the East-West pipeline and come out of the west coast of Saudi Arabia. And extremely importantly, it would mean that much of the world's trade that flows through those seaways would have to be rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, which adds weeks onto shipping times, as well as, of course, incredible levels of expense to the costs of shipping. So I think the kinds of inflationary effects that we are seeing with this war, the ways in which it's cascading down supply chains into transport, into shipping, would just amplify dramatically if that Bab al-Mandab was closed.
So I wanted to follow up on a point that you made earlier and that you really expound on in your book, Crude Capitalism, which is that it is no longer the case that the Middle East really is just this oil spigot, this upstream producer of crude that then goes off to be refined elsewhere or products made from it elsewhere. And that the Gulf economies really have developed to be a major producer themselves of other industrial inputs, in particular petrochemicals. And that complicates this whole scenario. It complicates the closure of the strait and adds to leverage in terms of the Iranian strategy of closing it. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit more, maybe perhaps about that process of diversification in the Gulf, but also about these petrochemicals and why they're so important as industrial inputs.
Yes. Well, there's a much longer history to this, which I think is important to speak to. Firstly, the petrochemical industry is present in all aspects of our lives. All of us, if you look around the room that you're sitting in, we are basically sitting in a sea of petrochemicals. We're talking here about plastics, artificial rubbers, nylon. Our clothing is made from these petrochemical substances, paints, the fertilizer products that I spoke to. All of these materials, synthetic materials that emerged really around the middle of the 20th century. After the Second World War, they really exploded onto the scene in terms of industrial production and shifted the nature of commodity production away from natural commodities like wood and glass and timber and cotton and so forth, supplanting them with these synthetic products that ultimately derived from oil and gas, hence the name petrochemicals. So this explosion in synthetic chemicals that occurred around the middle of the 20th century was really important in driving the shift to oil as the leading fossil fuel. It was at this moment that oil displaced coal as the principal fossil fuel. And it wasn't just because it was a liquid transport fuel. It wasn't just the petrol or the gasoline we put in our cars, but it was also because these other synthetic products, these petrochemicals, really began to be the basis of all commodity production, whether it be food, clothing, industry, construction, packaging, all of these sectors of the economy that depend upon this supply of oil-derived chemicals. Now, this shift, as I said, took place around the middle of the 20th century. And at that moment, the global oil industry was dominated by what were called the Seven Sisters. These were 7 large Western oil firms. 5 of them were American, 2 of them were European, 1 British and 1 Dutch. These are the kind of forerunners of the big Western companies we know today, ExxonMobil, for instance, or Shell or BP. These were all 7 sisters back at those days, these 7 large oil companies. And these 7 sisters, they controlled the whole of the oil value chain, which meant that it wasn't just the production of crude, the extraction of crude oil from under the ground. They also controlled the refining of that crude oil and, crucially, the production of these other kinds of oil products, like petrochemicals, like plastics, like nylon, like fertilizers, etc. So these were all part of the oil value chain, and they were controlled by these 7 Western oil firms. Now, what happened in the latter part of the 20th century and really in the early part of this century is that large national oil companies, mostly headquartered in the Gulf, in particular, Saudi Aramco is the important one. I'll say a little bit about that in a second. But what happened is these Gulf-based oil companies essentially followed in the footsteps of the 7 sisters in that they also moved down the value chain. They became much more vertically integrated. They became involved in all steps of the oil industry, including the production of petrochemicals. And that's why they are no longer today just exporters of crude oil. They are these large manufacturing complexes producing plastics, producing fertilizers, and so forth. So in terms of the specific petrochemicals, I've mentioned the fertilizers, but the other really important side to this is, of course, the plastics industry. The 2 key chemicals here are polymers of ethylene and polymers of propylene. These are the basic kind of inputs into all of the plastics that are around us. And about 40% of the world's exports of these basic plastics, again, come from the Gulf region. And again, mostly they flow eastward to China. So the kinds of global supply chains where we see manufacturing based in China, production of cheap and not so cheap goods in China, and then their export to markets elsewhere in the world, really are deeply linked to the supply of these basic petrochemicals. Now, the other side to this, of course, is the massive ecological consequences in this industry and the chemicals. But I think really what's important to say here is that we need to think about that kind of pollution, the plastics and the toxicity of these chemicals as not simply a question of a toxic pollution problem, but actually a question of its link with oil and link with the hydrocarbon industry. And that means the link with the Gulf. So that's why we have to rethink this question of petrochemicals as a question of oil, not just a question of better recycling or the toxicity that we become so accustomed to hear about in terms of these chemicals.
I wanted to ask about this narrative that has been coming out of the White House and by allies of the White House. This idea that America does not need the Strait of Hormuz. The phrases that I keep seeing thrown around by the White House are total energy dominance, that America is building up refining capacity, that it exports more LNG than ever, that it doesn't need the Gulf, it does not need oil from anywhere else, but any operation that it would undertake in the Strait of Hormuz would be out of national generosity, and any oil that it would take from other countries would be winner taking the spoils. Not something that America necessarily needs. Can you speak to how true or false that narrative of self-sufficiency is in terms of U.S. energy, U.S. petrochemical usage, or is this just all bluster?
Well, it's certainly true that the US is a net exporter of oil. This is a major shift in the global oil industry that took place over the last 10 to 15 years or so, particularly with the expansion of fracking and the shale industry in the United States. So the US does not depend upon Gulf oil. It imports oil from Canada, from the tar sands production in Canada, and there's a much more kind of interregional network of oil imports and exports through North America. but there isn't a dependence in the same way that there used to be on exports coming from the Gulf region. And it's also true that in the last week or so that the US exports of crude have increased. I think the last figures I saw from a few days ago were, I think, a 20% increase on the daily exports of US crude. And of course, another major export is the LNG exports from North America, which are flowing to Europe. Partly, this is a longer term process, partly in response to the reduction in LNG imports from Russia into the EU. So the EU is making up that shortfall partly through US LNG. So in that sense, the story of self-sufficiency does capture part of what has happened over the last decade or so. However, I think what it does is it misses the bigger global picture. And the United States cannot separate itself from the global economy. And any kind of prolonged closure will have a huge impact on the global economic environment through the price of oil, but also through all those other commodities that we've spoken about, and will also have huge social implications across the rest of the world, not least, of course, the global south. So in that sense, the US cannot extract itself from these global chains, and I think it would be extremely foolish. I certainly don't think either the Trump administration or anyone who knows anything about the region would consider that as a serious option, that kind of permanent ceiling of exports of oil and gas and other commodities from the Gulf.
Wouldn't banning or limiting exports just drive the global price of oil even higher? How could the US even conceive of insulating itself from all of the downstream inflation from this? I mean, you're talking about how that this is mostly an issue for China, but China is the workshop of the world in terms of producing all of the key inputs that the US is using in any of the domestic manufacturing it has. Isn't that correct? Like, if the price of plastic is going up and that plastic is going to China, and China is producing all of the things that US factories are using to produce anything that they make in the United States, it feels like it's totally a fantasy that the US could just kind of rely on these autarkic principles to protect itself from inflation that's happening elsewhere in the world.
I just want to add, just briefly, this is something that Senator Rick Scott said a couple of days ago at the Semaphore Global Forum. I think blocking the Strait of Hormuz is fine from my standpoint. If no oil ever goes to China again and their economy is destroyed, that would be a really wonderful day for me. I'm still very confused by how long they think this market manipulation and financial fantasy is supposed to go on for.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, to come back to your first point, Dylan, of course, this would have a huge impact on the price of oil, and that would be an impact that's felt globally, including in the United States. There is no way that the United States can seal itself off from the rest of the world. And the kind of inflationary implications that you've spoken to absolutely would be felt and are being felt. I mean, we can see this very clearly already in prices of manufacturing goods, in prices of fertilizers. Plastic prices are already increasing. And some countries are now being forced to curtail their production, in South Korea, for instance, of these kinds of products. So absolutely. However, I do think what is being said and the kinds of comments that you've just noted, Seamus, is that there is a sense in which the United States does view the Gulf's oil as a weapon, a potential weapon against China. And I think this is a long-standing kind of orientation of both the Biden and Trump administrations towards the Middle East. This is why the Middle East is so crucial within, I think, American policy globally. The attempt by the Trump administration to reassert its primacy in the Middle East is very much about the flow of these energy supplies to China and the potential impact if there was going to be a deeper conflict, a deepening of the conflict with China, the potential to cut those exports. Now, not for a permanent amount of time, but as a weapon, if you like, in any kind of deepening of that conflict with China. And we should also recognize that China itself is very aware of this potentiality. China consumes around a quarter of the world's oil imports. It's a remarkable figure. Back in the year 2000, it was only 4% of the world's oil imports went to China. Today, it's 1/4. 1 in 4 barrels of oil go to China. So it's absolutely crucial to China's industrial and manufacturing strategy to have these energy sources continuing to flow. And what the Chinese government has done in the last, actually going back several years now, is to very deliberately seek to increase stockpiles of crude oil and also to diversify its supply chains. So the actual level of those stockpiles is not publicly known, but it's clearly massive, and it was clearly a strategic decision to do so, precisely because of the potentiality of the threats that we see today. All of this, however, doesn't detract from the fact the Gulf is the largest supplier of oil and gas to China in the world, and it will remain that way. So it will, I think, remain absolutely central to the bigger kind of American strategic vision globally.
Yeah, I want to ask about that, but I did just, I saw recently someone posted I think it was a Wall Street Journal piece from September of last year that is like, why is China stockpiling so much oil? This is like totally ridiculous and also it's a threat of some kind. It's like, well, okay, this is why. But I wanted to kind of follow up on this point about this East-East hydrocarbon axis. And you really flesh out this story very well in your book about how over the past couple of decade and a half, the Middle East oil and other industrial inputs, downstream products have been directed east to Asia and primarily to satisfy China's massive demand for energy, as you've just explained. And just reading this, I found it pretty funny because I recall very vividly, as I'm sure many in the United States do as well, President Obama bragging about how he made the U.S. energy independent. And I'm sure that he did do some stuff on the level of policy. But as you write it, I mean, really the main story here is the massive increase of Chinese demand as China, entered in its hyper rapid industrialization, because it seems like that basically single-handedly juiced the price of oil so high that it made all kinds of massive expenditures for exploration and expensive extraction in terms of shale and fracking and offshore drilling. It made all of that profitable enough for U.S. private firms to do, which then increased the U.S. production. So really, it's like a story of Chinese growth and the impacts of that. But I did want to kind of follow up on the strategic point, because it does seem like the world today is, in terms of the circulation of oil, is characterized by a relatively closed loop in North America of North American oil being consumed in North America, and then an increasingly integrated Middle East and Asia. And you talked about it as a potential strategic weapon from the US's point of view. But I'm wondering if there is a story to tell about the other side of that. If the US actually is not going to engage in a confrontation with China, and I think many people are looking at how this war is going and thinking, well, what would happen if the US tried to fight a war with China? It probably wouldn't go so well. And in the event that we're not on the road to, some larger civilizational World War III, what have you, do you see a way in which that dynamic would actually accelerate U.S. hegemonic decline and encourage states in the global south or elsewhere in the world to orient themselves around China?
Let me just firstly deal with that question of the East-East and flesh that out a bit, because I think there's some important details to this that we really need to dig a bit deeper into. You're absolutely right. And as I've just explained, there was this eastward shift in the world's oil exports away from Western Europe and the United States towards China becoming responsible for 25% of the world's crude imports, as I've just said. Now, this, by the way, it wasn't just a zero-sum game. It's not like the oil was flowing initially west and then it switched east. It was also associated with a very substantial increase in the global consumption of oil over the last 2 decades. So this, of course, brings up all of the climate questions that we need to foreground in this discussion, that there was a massive increase in the global demand and consumption of oil from the early 2000s onwards. And at the same time, this shift in the Gulf's exports eastward to China and also wider East Asia, Korea, Singapore, Japan, and Indonesia, and so forth. So, as you said, this led to an increase, or was associated with an increase in the price of oil, which peaked at at about 150 US dollars in the middle of the year 2008, and then fell back after the 2008 crisis, then went back up, peaking again in around 2014. So what this did, it's very important to emphasize this point, this kind of prolonged price rise in oil and the big demand increase in oil and gas that came from China's rise also meant a huge influx of petrodollars or financial surpluses into the Gulf states. Billions and trillions of dollars, in fact, flowing into the Gulf states. So, this is important because it was these petrodollar surpluses that allowed the Gulf and the national oil companies to embark on this downward diversification that I spoke of earlier. This is why they were able to become such powerhouses in fertilizer production and other petrochemical production and so forth. So there was a very close link between China's emergence as a major center of capital accumulation, a major manufacturing center, its demand, therefore, for energy, and therefore the accumulation of these financial surpluses in the Gulf as a result of these exports of oil and gas to China. Now, it's also really important when we're thinking about this East-East connection to not just think about it in terms of the export of crude oil, but also investment flows between the Gulf and China. So there are now in the petrochemical industry in China very significant investments by Gulf oil companies, in particular Saudi Aramco, that company I mentioned earlier, Saudi Aramco, which is the largest oil company in the world by far. Its profits last year exceeded the combined profits of the 5 largest Western firms. Wow. ExxonMobil, Total Energies, BP, Shell, and Chevron. So you add up the profits of those 5 big Western firms. Aramco's profits exceeded that last year and the year before, by the way. So, Aramco has become very closely engaged in the petrochemical industry in China and throughout the wider East Asia. In South Korea, for instance, the largest petrochemical plant in the region is currently being constructed by Saudi Aramco. So we see, in other words, the kind of insertion of the Gulf inside these production chains, these manufacturing circuits in China and East Asia, this deep embedding in these kinds of commodity circuits. And the process is happening vice versa as well. China's investments in the Gulf region are very substantial. Last year, its investments in Saudi Arabia overtook greenfield or new foreign direct investment, overtook the United States in Saudi Arabia. So we see these kind of deep interdependencies connecting both regions, the Middle East, China, East Asia, in very substantial ways. So that's the bigger picture to this East-East circuit. However, I do think that we shouldn't read this story as simply, a shift away from the United States by the Gulf monarchies I'm speaking about here, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Cooperation Council states, because these states still are very deeply connected and dependent upon the United States for military and security protection, as we've seen over the last few weeks, but also because there are very substantial investments by the Gulf states in US financial markets. And those haven't gone away with this East-East circuit. In fact, they have increased. So the Gulf investments in US equity markets, for instance, have tripled since 2017. About 5% of all foreign investments in US companies on the US stock market is coming from the Gulf. So it's very substantial and it's increasing. So I don't think we can read it as a simple kind of disengagement from US power, but it certainly speaks to the complexity of this global system in which we're now living.
Yeah, I want to just follow up on that briefly because, I think the kind of traditional story of the petrodollar is that oil contracts being denominated in USD has really secured the centrality of the dollar to the global financial system and structured these relationships with the Gulf, where surpluses held in dollars in the Gulf are then recycled back into the US economy, recycled in the form of buying security or buying military hardware, and then also US treasuries. Has that story shifted? I think we could talk about it, from the high point of 2014, but over the past decade itself, are those security relationships still taking the form of this petrodollar recycling, or has it been detached from that at all?
Well, maybe just to step back a little bit and flesh out some of the longer history of this. This relationship between the United States and the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia is the key actor here, really emerged in the 1970s at a moment when Nixon severs the connection between the dollar and gold. The dollar begins to float freely. And at the same time, the Gulf and other oil-producing states nationalize their crude resources. And so therefore, we have the oil price spikes in the 1970s and then a big increase in financial surpluses flowing into the Gulf as a result of that. So this kind of relationship at that moment, the United States really cements its relationship with Saudi Arabia through providing and guaranteeing, if you like, the security and the protection of the Saudi ruling family, the Saudi monarchy, in return for the Saudi government basically becoming incorporated into the US sphere of influence. And what does that mean practically? The big thing that the Saudi government does as the leader of OPEC, the most important oil producing state in OPEC, is to, by about 1974, guarantee that all oil sales, exports, are denominated in US dollars. Up until that point, about 20% of the world's oil trade was denominated in sterling, in British sterling. So making that link between oil and the US dollar was a very important step because it meant that all countries in the world that needed to buy the world's most important commodity at that moment, oil, needed to have US dollar reserves. And the US dollar really was established in this way as the international reserve currency, a position that it still holds today, despite the challenge that might be presented by other currencies. So this was the kind of link between oil and dollars. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia, as you pointed out, agrees to invest its financial surpluses into US markets. Treasury bonds are very important, particularly in the initial phase here. But today, there's a range of other kinds of ways in which dollar surpluses in the Gulf recirculate into the United States. So the equities or stock market is a one that I just noted, 5% of all foreign investment in equity markets coming from the Gulf. And that proportion has increased over the last 10 years or so. I was looking at these figures just a couple of months ago, so this is fairly up to date. The other side to this is investments by sovereign wealth funds. The Gulf is a huge sovereign wealth fund center globally. Sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf control about $4.9 trillion in assets, which again has increased by about 30% in just the last 5 years. So it's a very significant center. These are state-owned funds that basically deploy the state's wealth in investments, either domestically or internationally. And these sovereign wealth funds, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, predominantly flow to the United States. And that, again, hasn't changed over the last few years. In fact, it's increased. The biggest sovereign wealth funds, the majority of their investments continue to be in the United States into US assets. And then the other really important part of this story, of course, is the Gulf's consumption of military hardware. The Gulf states consume around about a fifth of all global arms imports. They are the largest region in the world for the imports of military hardware. And the majority of this, overwhelming majority, is supplied by the US. So we have these US military manufacturers selling weapons systems to the Gulf, to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and so forth, and thereby allowing through these sales more financial surpluses to recirculate back into those US companies. So again, these linkages are very tight and they haven't decreased over the last 5 years or so. In fact, they have gotten stronger. Now, what might happen in the wake of this war is a different question, and whether there might be attempts to kind of demarcate oil in Chinese yuan or cryptocurrency has been suggested in some ranks. We'll have to see. But I do think we need to kind of really foreground the kind of long-standing relationship between the Gulf monarchies and the United States, as it's not just a question of money, it's a question of the way in which the United States guarantees the survival of these monarchies. And that is something that no other power is able to replicate. And that's, I think, really important to think about when we're talking about the petrodollar system.
I wanted to ask about this talk of taking the oil, something that Trump has invoked a lot over his administration. You wrote back in January for the Verso blog about what the actual logic was behind dominating Venezuela. It's something that he's also threatened to do with Iran, obviously something he attempted to do with Syria, something he said we should have done in Iraq. Can you explain what precisely the aim was with Venezuela, how taking the oil is supposed to manifest, and how that process might be distinct with regards to Iran? I mean, if Iran is even in the position where America could, quote unquote, take its oil.
Yes, I'm very skeptical that the US has the capacity to take Iran's oil, even if it wanted to. And I think in the case of Venezuela, it was very interesting to watch at that moment the big US oil companies basically say, no, we're not willing to put the billions that were necessary into the investment of Venezuelan oil fields in order to be able to increase production in the country. So I don't think that what was at play in Venezuela, despite what Trump himself or others might have said, was about the direct seizure of Venezuelan oil. I think the reason for abduction of Maduro and his wife, and also the bigger kind of intervention in Venezuela, was much more to do with reasserting American power in the Western Hemisphere. And this was explicitly stated by a number of the key figures in the Trump administration, and indeed Trump himself, I believe. We have seen over the last decade or so an increasing realignment of states in Latin America with China, connections, economic and political connections with China. And I think this was primarily aimed at sending a message to states that these are the consequences of any kind of shift away from the United States by Latin American countries. Now, that's not to say that there won't be attempts to expand Venezuelan oil production. I'm sure American oil companies would be involved in that kind of endeavor. I think there are other parts of this story, for instance, neighboring Guyana near Venezuela, where ExxonMobil has huge oil reserves and is really highlighted in annual reports in recent years that this is where ExxonMobil will meet its kind of crude supplies from. And there was a dispute about those reserves between the Venezuelan government and Guyana. So I think that is another side to this story that is very important to consider. I also think the other side is the kinds of debt or the fines that were owed to some of the big American oil companies due to nationalization of oil in Venezuela that could conceivably now come to be paid as a result of the invasion. So, I think those are kinds of the bigger pictures. And I think it was much more about kind of, again, reasserting American power in the region rather than a direct seizure of the oil. And I think similarly, that's the case in Iran. I don't think it's about the kind of attempt to directly take Iranian oil, which I don't think is possible in the current moment.
So I was wondering if you could just step back a bit. I mean, you are a scholar both of oil and of the Middle East. And, maybe even setting aside some of the more nakedly cronyist, corrupted elements of the Trump administration, I'm curious what your take is on the oil logic of U.S. foreign policy more broadly. I grew up during the Iraq War, raised by leftist parents, and I was told always growing up that this is a war about oil. Forget all of the freedom rhetoric. This is about controlling oil. This is about taking Iraqi oil and the profits of U.S. oil companies. What is your assessment of that? I mean, what role do you think oil has played in the broader story of U.S. imperialism, particularly in the post 9/11 period?
Well, I think oil remains absolutely central to capitalism and the way that capitalism functions, and therefore American power globally. And that's been the case stretching all the way back to the Second World War, where we saw this transition to oil as the leading fossil fuel and the emergence at the same time of the United States as the dominant global power. And those two shifts, transition to oil and the transition to American power, were deeply linked. They cannot be separated. And there's a long story to this, but I think remains true today. Having said that, I think we need to reject simplistic accounts that read the US policy in the Middle East as simply about wanting to seize oil supplies. The way that the oil industry works is because of its structure of upstream and downstream production, the extraction of crude oil, and then its refining and its transport and its shipping and sale to everywhere else in the world. the industry doesn't necessarily need control over the upstream or crude supplies. And in fact, as the last 40 years has very clearly demonstrated, in the Gulf, for instance, where those oil supplies are under the control of national oil companies, it's possible, and the US did very successfully, incorporate those states into the bigger American alliance in the region. So it's not about the direct ownership of oil supplies in that kind of crude, if you pardon the pun, way. But of course, whatever happens in the Middle East is about oil. And for those reasons that we've spoke about earlier, particularly the ways in which oil is so significant to China's rise as a major manufacturing power and China's dependence upon these oil supplies, the ways that the financial surpluses from the sale of oil are bound up with American financial power, that makes oil really critical to the structure of global capitalism. And that's why the Middle East is important. It is about oil in that sense. But, to take the example you raised of Iraq and the 2003 war against Iraq, that was preceded, of course, by the 1990s, the war against Iraq, and then the blockade embargo on Iraq as well for a decade. That period, I think, was not about directly taking Iraq's oil by Western oil firms, which hasn't happened to a significant degree. It is more about the control or the kind of bringing a state that was seen to be outside of the American, umbrella in the Middle East, basically destroying that state and trying to reincorporate it into the American system, the US system of alliances in the region. So it is about oil, but not in the way that maybe it's often presented, is the short answer, I would say.
Going a little bit back to taking the oil, I'm curious how you detected the shift from talking about wars being for oil being this complete taboo, how the idea that American wars could be for oil was something that was unpalatable to both Democrats and Republicans. And how did it go from that to a dominant, open foreign policy goal amongst Republicans? How did it become so openly desirable to demand another country's natural resources for oneself?
Well, I think this is perhaps symptomatic of the moment or the era that we are living in the sense that we are living, and I think this is really important to kind of foreground in all of these discussions about, the relative decline of American power and multipolarity and so forth. We're living at a time of multiple global crises, and all states attempting to deal and find their ways out of these crises or displace them onto other countries. So I'm talking here, for instance, about the huge levels of overproduction and overcapacity we see in the global economy. We see that through multiple economic sectors in industry and elsewhere. We see the rise in public and private debt at record levels across the world associated with the kind of financialization that we've seen in capitalism in the last few decades. We see, of course, the climate emergency as really hitting and becoming palpable in weather systems across the world. So there's multiple forms of these crises that we can see. And I think this is the bigger global context in which Trump is a symptom of, if you like. Trumpism and the rightward shift we see across all states is a symptom of this system in crisis. And what Trump is, in my reading, attempting to do, or I should say Trump's political project, because I don't think we should personalize it in that kind of way, but that project is an attempt to deal with that relative American decline, which I think is absolutely real, in the context of these bigger global crises. And that means being much more naked in the use of force. It means expecting countries that were allies to shoulder part of the bill for the costs of American hegemony. And it means punishing those who step outside of that hegemony. And all of that is at play in this war and since Trump was elected. So, this again is not just a question of the United States. We see the same kinds of patterns at play in governments across the world. And associated with this, of course, is the weakening in a broader political legitimacy of kind of mainstream politics that we can see associated with these kinds of systems in crisis. So all of what I've said is not to say, of course, that Trump will be successful or that American project will be successful. But I do think we need to see it as a symptom of these bigger crises and not simply as the way it's sometimes very lazily read as simply, Trump's narcissism or an attempt to kind of benefit personally from these kinds of deals. I don't think that's the right way to read American policy. There is a capitalist logic that is at play here.
I wanted to close out by asking you about perhaps the biggest and or most threatening of these global crises, which is, as you named, the climate emergency. I've seen some speculation that the geoeconomic vulnerability that has been exposed by this moment being the war, would accelerate a shift away from reliance on oil and maybe push states more towards renewables, electric vehicles, et cetera, in part because states dependent on imported fossil fuels will want to build out contingencies in the event of war-related oil shocks. Do you see any upside to this crisis in terms of an energy transition, or are you less optimistic on that front?
I mean, to be very frank, I think that assessment is wrong. I don't think that this war is in any way going to accelerate a move away from fossil fuels, unfortunately. And there's a couple of points why I think this is the case. Firstly, is this notion of the so-called green transition is, I think, really a red herring, in the sense that if we look at actually what has happened in the last decade or so, certainly there's been an expansion in renewable energy capacity in many countries across the world. China is the leading example, of course, the increase in renewable capacity being very significant. But what we also see is the increase in fossil fuel consumption take place alongside this expansion in renewables. Last year was the largest consumption of oil, gas, and coal in history. And the year before was also a record for that year in history. So we see here very clearly that there is no transition taking place. It's not like renewables are shifting us away from a fossil system. They are being layered atop an existing fossil fuel substructure, if you like. And this is exactly what happened in the middle of the 20th century when oil emerged as the leading fossil fuel. What happened at that moment is that coal production continued to increase, but oil was added on top of that. And that is the root of the climate emergency that we're currently living. And then later, of course, natural gas expanded on that. And this speaks, I think, to the bigger logics of capitalism, in the sense that there is a tendency for an ever-increasing throughput of energy into the system because of this pursuit of endless growth, endless accumulation. The only moments when energy consumption tends to drop are those in which there are major economic crises, such as the 2008 crisis, such as COVID, and in fact, the largest in the early 1980s, the 1980 economic crisis was actually the biggest drop in oil consumption over the last 50 years or so. So we can see this clear connection between energy consumption and accumulation. And in this sense, this talk of a green transition, I think, is very misleading. It's additive and not a replacement. To speak directly to the current moment, it's very clear if you look at the policy responses in Europe, in the United States, and in fact around the world, that the danger or what this crisis is being used to do is actually ramp up the production of hydrocarbons in the name of energy security and to move away from any kind of decarbonization, moving away from regulations around environmental restrictions in agriculture or oil and gas mining, lifting those kinds of things. So I think, unfortunately, we're actually seeing a lock-in of fossil fuels here that will tie the world more tightly to hydrocarbons in the future. The final point here, I just want to point out, because I think it's often missed in this discussion of the war, is the actual climate consequences of the war itself. You know, modern warfare is oil-fueled warfare. You know, all of the kinds of military hardware that's needed to wage war depends upon fossil fuels. And this is another reason why oil really emerged as the central fossil fuel during and immediately after the Second World War. It's hugely carbon intensive waging war. And the destruction of all the infrastructure and buildings that we've seen in Iran, in the Gulf, in Lebanon itself is hugely carbon intensive, because the rebuilding of those structures requires concrete, which is a highly emission prone substance. So the waging of war itself is also accelerating this climate emergency. There was an excellent study that came out from the Climate and Community Institute, I think, into the first 2 weeks of this war, that pointed out that more than 5 million tons of carbon dioxide were produced just in the first 2 weeks of this war. And that was equivalent, according to this study, of the annual emissions of Iceland. So we can see, the kinds of acceleration of the climate catastrophe is another consequence of this US-Israeli war against Iran.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, Dr. Hanieh, the only way that this would be good on a climate level is if it totally crashes the global economy and we enter into a prolonged period of depression and demand destruction. Is that right?
Well, I don't think that's a scenario we should be wishing, but it does point to the need to move away from fossil fuels, both because of its climate implications, but also because of the deep linkages between war, militarism, and fossil fuels. There is no way to break with that connection, I think, apart from moving away from fossil fuels themselves.
Dr. Hanieh, thank you so much for your time. This has been a very enriching conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.